Today we will speak about the global dimension of political geography studies, so-called geopolitics. There are three basic approaches to the analysis of international relations. First, the history of international relations studies international processes through a historical lens. Second, the theory or sociology of international relations interprets international processes from the point of view of the internal social order, political, economic, cultural, etc. Finally, the third, the geography of international relations or geopolitics, analyzes international processes through the structural geographic prism. The geopolitical aspect adds an important dimension to the analysis of international relations. The geographical distribution of power is unequal, with the places of power or centers of its concentration that change its location. There are also power asymmetries, with different forces dominating different realms. Some states will mainly rely on soft power in building their relation with others, while some promote hard power as the most effective tool. It's worth noting that the fathers of geopolitics focused mainly on geography as the most durable characteristics in international relations. As a result, geopolitics came under criticism for geographical determinism. Modern revisionism and critical geopolitics adopted a less categorical alternative put forward by Nicholas Spickman. He claimed that geography creates conditions and offers opportunities rather than predeterminates the outcome. The American geographer also believed geography was a conditioning factor rather than a determinative one. This approach is called geographical possibilism. The global distribution of power can be stable, so it stays unchanged for a long time. In this case, it implies the global geopolitical systems, or geopolitical equilibriums. However, one equilibrium can be evolving into another one, so a new geopolitical order may be on the rise, with the older one on the decline. The geopolitical system is the model of spatial distribution of power. There are several types of global geopolitical systems. Antagonistic systems, where the world is divided into competing subsystems or mega-regions. They can be either binary, like the West versus the East, or ternary, like the center, periphery, semi-periphery in world system perspective. It could be concentric systems, where there exists the geographical center of gravity, like in heartland theory. There could be polar systems, where there exist dominant centers of power. Such systems can be further subdivided into unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar ones. Another type, civilization-centered systems, where the distribution of power occurs between sustainable historical and cultural areas. Finally, there are regional systems, where the distribution of power occurs between macro and meso-regions identified geographically. Human thinking is dialectical, which is why global political space is structured through separation. The highest level is represented by binary geopolitical systems, which comprise two antagonistic forces, mega-regions. For example, the old world versus the new world. This is a division into the regions which Europeans knew about before the age of discovery, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the ones they discovered, America and Australia. Another type, the West versus the East. This is a divide generated by the confrontation between Greeks in the West and Persians in the East, and has ever since been affecting the emergence of civilizational dichotomies most intensively. The common mindset and the proximity in perception in the global West, Europe, America, Australia, arose in opposition to those in the global East, Asia and Africa, mainly Arabs, Turks and Russians. To that end, the West artificially attributed opposing features to the East, such as tyranny, mysticism, and collectivism. This process, called Orientalism, is the antithesis to Occidentalism, stereotypical representations of the Western world by the East through the attribution of opposite traits: expansionism, exceptionalism, and mercantilism. The last example of binary geopolitical system, the North versus the South, is the divide into developed states in Europe, North America, and Australia, and developing ones in Asia, Africa, and South America. The older interpretation refers to the division into exploiters and exploited nations. The model shows uneven development across the globe. The global North accounts for 1/3 of the world's population and 80% of the world income, while the global South has 2/3 of the population and earns only 20% of the world income. Polar geopolitical systems posits a series of poles with the magnetic appeals to countries and peoples within the international system. Polar geopolitical systems includes unipolarity, bipolarity, and multipolarity. Frequently, the distinction is mistakenly drawn merely by counting the number of poles. However, the difference is qualitative or structural rather than quantitative. Instead of pointing the number of poles, they reflect the ways of maintaining the balance of power in international relations or prevent global conflicts. However, the basis for the balance varies. In the unipolar model, the balance of power rests on the universal appeal of a country's values and their non-alternative character for other states, rather than on the dominance of the country, as others can always unite against it. This model is also called mondialism. As a result, countries sharing values are less prone to go to war against one another. For instance, Kant's theory on the democratic world, which posits the democracies do not fight one another, is the cornerstone of the concept of the current US domination in international relations. In the bipolar model, the balance of power tends to be maintained through the balance between the centers of power. To that end, the poles engaged allies across the globe and create so-called fixed coalitions. It implies that allied states support the pole on every issue, from security to ideology. The balance of power between the USA and the USSR was ensured by strategic parity, primarily in nuclear weapons and its intercontinental delivery. In the multipolar model, the balance of power rests on the interdependence of international actors. It cannot have fixed coalitions, as countries guard national interest while interacting, and can enter a military bloc led by one pole, while actively building up trade one with another country. So they build so-called ad hoc coalitions. As a result, the universal interdependence prevents global confrontation and enables countries to pursue an independent policy from stronger poles. Therefore, it is rather a model without a pole than a multipolar one. The balance of power in all models is dynamic rather than static. Modern studies focus on the mechanisms of creating and maintaining the balance of power instead of merely finding its formula and its geometry, the West versus the East, the North versus the South, etc. In this case, the balance of power is no longer global, with only some great powers acting as key actors. Regional and local subsystems becomes its components. This is the bottom-up process because it is shaped by all international actors rather than great powers alone. Thus, the description of the world should not stay within the narrow formula of a single geopolitical model. In fact, the types of the global balance of power compete across the globe. Sometimes this competition triggers a grave crisis in the entire system, when, for example, a country seeks to live in a multipolar world of ad hoc coalitions, but it is forced by others to side with either of two poles. Great powers are still the main players of the polar geopolitical system. The following traits are integral to a great power. First, the ability to exercise a considerable influence on the global architecture and shape its foreign policy independently. Second, this country has resources to safeguard its interests on the world stage. Vast territory or large population, natural resources, military, technological, economic, human, and cultural potential. Third, there is an awareness of their spatial global role and ability to think globally in this country. And they are based on traditionally active involvement in world politics of such a country. 4. This is a recognition of a great power by other international actors. Depending on how unchanging their status is, great powers are divided into the following types. A consistent power, like the US. They typically have resources and pursue active foreign policy, as well as enjoy the full recognition of their status. The strongest influence on global process and independence from both inconsistent great powers and non-great powers. They engage in various types of interstate interactions, from cooperating to set up international regimes, bodies and institutions, to using force like imposing sanctions, interstate conflicts and wars. Another type, an emerging power, rising power or underachiever like Brazil or India. Such countries have resources and are active internationally, but do not possess a recognized great power status. These states tend to act as regional powers, dominating for the time being in a regional subsystem of international relations. Some states which fall a long way of traditional emerging powers can still regard themselves as such. Finally, there could be revisionist power or overachievers. Such countries are recognized as great powers internationally. However, they have lost a number of resources, primarily material ones, and no longer impact on the international agenda that greatly. Such states usually opt for cooperation in their foreign policy and actively engage in creating new world bodies.